On the evening of April 13th, 1970, three men were 200,000 miles from Earth. They were halfway to the moon. Routine was the word their commanders used. Routine stir of the oxygen tanks, routine telemetry check. And then Jack Swigard's voice, calm, measured, almost puzzled, came through the line to mission control. "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." Not Mayday, not help, just, we've had a problem. That restraint, that trained, deliberate calm in the face of the unknown. That is the first thing worth understanding about what happened on Apollo 13. Because what followed was not a story about a spacecraft. It was a story about how human beings think, decide, and hold themselves together when everything is falling apart. By 1970, the moon had already been conquered. Neil Armstrong had walked on it 8 months earlier. The networks had moved on. Two of America's three major television networks refused to carry the Apollo 3 live broadcast from space, the one the crew made just hours before the explosion. Nobody was watching. The Apollo program had become, in the minds of the American public, ordinary, expected, a thing that worked. And that, psychologically, is one of the most dangerous places a human institution can be. When we believe something cannot fail, what happens to our ability to see that it is failing? The oxygen tank that would destroy Apollo 13 had already been broken for 2 years. It had been dropped slightly, barely, just 2 inches, during installation on a previous mission. A small thing. The exterior was inspected. It seemed fine. Later, during pre-launch testing, the tank couldn't be emptied correctly. Engineers noticed. They wrote it in a report. Then they boiled the remaining oxygen out of it with 8 hours of sustained heat. Heat so intense, it melted the Teflon insulation around the electrical wires inside. And they launched anyway. Not because they were reckless, not because they didn't care, because every warning had been rationalized, every anomaly had been explained. The tank passed its tests, the numbers were acceptable, and the entire institution around them was humming with confidence. In psychology, this is called normalization of deviance. The idea that when small warning signs go unaddressed and nothing bad immediately happens, those warning signs stop feeling like warnings. They become normal, background noise. The sociologist Diane Vaughan coined that phrase 15 years later, studying another NASA disaster, the Challenger. The same pattern. But on April 11th, 1970, none of that language existed yet. Apollo 13 launched on schedule. Jim Lovell was 42 years old. He had flown 3 missions before this. He had orbited the moon on Apollo 8, been the first human to watch the Earth disappear behind it. He was, by any measure, a man who had made his peace with the possibility of dying in space. Fred Hayes was 35. Jack Swigert was 38. A last-minute replacement for Ken Mattingly, who had been pulled from the mission 4 days before launch because he'd been exposed to the measles. Swigert hadn't even been sure he was going, and now he was 200,000 miles from Earth. Mission Control asked the crew to perform a routine procedure: stir the fans inside the cryogenic oxygen tanks to prevent the liquid oxygen from stratifying. Swigert flipped a switch. The explosion blew an entire panel off the side of the service module. It ruptured the number 1 oxygen tank. It disabled 2 of the 3 fuel cells that generated the ship's electrical power. In under 3 hours, Apollo 13 would lose all of its oxygen, all of its water, and most of its electricity. The spacecraft was dying. So what do? 200,000 miles from Earth when your vehicle begins to die around you. Here is what Lovell did not do. He did not panic. He looked out the left window and saw gas venting into space. He reported it calmly to Houston. He and Swigert tried to close the hatch between the command module and the lunar module. It wouldn't latch. They tried twice. They moved on. There's a particular kind of training that produces this response. Astronauts are selected and conditioned specifically to resist the psychological gravitational pull of catastrophizing. Instead, they are trained to do one thing: work the problem in front of them, not the problem they fear is coming. The problem right now, in this moment, that they can actually address. Gene Kranz, the flight director on the ground, would later crystallize it. Not the movie line everyone knows. What he actually said to his team was this: "I've never lost an American in space. Sure as hell aren't gonna lose one now. This crew is coming home. You gotta believe it. Your team must believe it, and we must make it happen." The lunar module, call sign Aquarius, had been built to land 2 men on the moon and bring them back up again. It carried its own oxygen, its own batteries, its own engine. It had never been designed to keep 3 men alive for 4 days. When you are given a problem that the tools in your hands were not made to solve, what does your brain do? Most people, under extreme stress, narrow. The cognitive tunnel closes. They see fewer options. They reach for what they know. The men in mission control, the ones who weren't in the spacecraft, who weren't cold and wet and afraid, they had a different problem. They had to think expansively, while also thinking fast. Kranz divided his controllers into separate teams and assigned each one a specific survival problem: power, oxygen, water, navigation, re-entry. He told each team, "Don't worry about the other problems. Yours is the only problem that exists." That is not an obvious response to a crisis. The obvious response is to hold a meeting, present everything, discuss every threat simultaneously. But Kranz understood something about group problem solving under pressure that psychology would later confirm in study after study: that when a group faces too many simultaneous threats, their collective attention fragments. They make worse decisions. The best structure for crisis cognition is to isolate the problems, assign them, and reunite only at the synthesis stage. And so they worked. To extend the power, they had to shut down nearly everything on Aquarius: the heaters, the displays, the guidance computer. The interior temperature dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew couldn't sleep. They were rationed to 6 ounces of drinking water a day. Hayes developed a urinary tract infection. Swigert's feet swelled from the cold. Lovell watched the moon pass beneath them, the moon he had trained for years to walk on, and said nothing. He would later say he doesn't remember being afraid. He remembers being busy. Then came the problem nobody had planned for: carbon dioxide. Both spacecraft used lithium hydroxide canisters to scrub CO2 from the air, but the command module canisters were square. The lunar module ports were round. With 3 men breathing in a capsule designed for 2, CO2 levels were rising toward the point where the crew would lose consciousness. The engineers in Houston had exactly what the crew had on board: no more. They spread the same equipment on the table: plastic bags, cardboard, duct tape, a spacesuit hose. And they built something: an adapter, a connector between incompatible systems. They radioed the instructions up, one step at a time. The crew built it. It worked. What does it mean that 3 men 200,000 miles from Earth, cold and exhausted and afraid, were able to build that thing? The psychologist Carl Weick studied what he called high reliability organizations, systems that operate in dangerous environments and somehow fail less often than they should. His conclusion was that what separates them is not better equipment or better luck. It's a willingness to improvise, to trust people with problems, to treat expertise as something spread across a team rather than locked at the top. NASA in 1970 was, in that precise moment, a high-reliability organization functioning at its highest level. Not because everything had gone right, because everything had gone wrong, and they had prepared, however imperfectly, for exactly that. There was one final problem. To come home, the crew had to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere through a window roughly the size of a doorway. Too steep an angle, and the heat shield would fail. Too shallow, and they would skip off the atmosphere like a stone off water and never return. The explosion had pushed them slightly off course. To correct it, they had to fire the lunar module's descent engine manually, without the guidance computer, which had been powered down to save electricity, and hold the burn steady by hand while watching the Earth through the window. Jim Lovell, using nothing but visual reference and training, fired the engine for 14 seconds. The correction was nearly perfect. When the command module hit the atmosphere, Mission Control lost contact. That was expected. The ionization of re-entry blocks all radio signals. The blackout was supposed to last 3 minutes. It lasted 6. In the worldwide silence of those extra 3 minutes, 40 million people were watching their television sets. Marilyn Lovell was in the VIP room at Mission Control. The entire planet seemed to hold its breath in the same instant. Hello, Houston. This is Odyssey. It's good to see you again. They had been gone 6 days. They had traveled 500,000 miles. They had not slept. They had barely eaten or drunk. One of them was sick, and they were alive. Jim Lovell never went back to space. Apollo 13 was his last mission. He spent the rest of his career watching other men walk on the moon. He would later say this, that the most remarkable thing about those 6 days was not the engineering, it was the decision-making. Not the decisions made under perfect conditions, with full information, with time to deliberate, but the ones made in the dark, with bad data, with 90 seconds to choose. Here's what Apollo 13 actually teaches us about human behavior under extreme pressure. First, calm is a skill, not a personality trait. The astronauts were not naturally unafraid. They were trained to delay the expression of fear long enough to act. That gap between feeling and reaction is something that can be practiced, narrowed, or widened, depending on what you do with it. Second, how a group handles uncertainty reveals everything about its real culture. Not its stated values, not its org chart, but the actual norms and habits that show up when things go wrong. NASA's finest moment was not launching a rocket. It was the 87 hours that followed an explosion, when every assumption was overturned and every procedure had to be invented on the fly. Third, the things that nearly killed them were not the dramatic failures. They were the quiet, accumulated small compromises. The dropped tank, the overlooked switch, the anomaly that got normalized. History is full of catastrophes that weren't sudden. They were slow, they were gradual. They were a long series of moments where someone decided that something slightly wrong was close enough to right. Apollo 13 launched on April 11th, 1970. It returned on April 17th. 6 days, 500,000 miles, 3 men. And at the end of it, all anyone could really say was what Jack Swigert said as they watched the lunar module Aquarius, their lifeboat, their salvation, the vehicle they lived in for 4 days, drift away from them before re-entry, jettisoned into darkness. Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you.